Next up, we have Abigail Hing Wen. She is the author of the New York Times best-selling Loveboat Taipei and the newly released sequel Loveboat Reunion. Is that right? There it is. Okay. Wow. She has earned a degree in international business from Harvard, a law degree from Columbia, an MFA in creative writing. She's worked in Silicon Valley on artificial intelligence. She has an artificial intelligence podcast. You've been on Entertainment Weekly, Cosmo, Forbes, Hollywood. My goodness, Abigail, how do you have the energy? Where do you find the time?
I just do what I love. I have a blast, and I'm so happy to be here to meet with all of you. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you for being here. You were interested and very skilled in so many areas: law, literature, politics, the tech industry. How did you start this love of this multifaceted, view of the world of how you wanted to experience everything?
I didn't realize this is the case until I became a writer, but writers are interested in everything. They have, I think I've always just been really curious about the world. I grew up in Solon, Ohio, which had a very strong STEM program. And I actually was very, very heavily involved in math and science as a child. All through high school, I was on the Science Olympiad Club. I actually was the president my senior year. And I believe we were the first team that went on to nationals. But even in Science Olympiad, I was also doing things like this program called Write It, Do It, which you would actually write about the things that you saw and try to communicate, because science communication is also really important. And when I went to Harvard, I studied chemistry, but realized that I actually was more interested in like international relations. And so I find like as I've just begun my writing process, all these different aspects of who I was have come to bear and now are incorporated in my various stories.
Abigail, I find as a college teacher, so many of my students have been forced into one thing. Like, what is your major? What is the one thing you do? And what I love how you describe that, which is we should be well versed in everything and curious about everything. How did you become a writer and reader too? Like, were you always a reader from an early age?
I always was. And some of my favorite books were like the Chronicles of Narnia and Laura Ingalls. So they weren't necessarily STEM books, but I did love high fantasy books as well. Sci-fi, I read some, wasn't really so much my cup of tea. And I have actually been writing my whole life. I don't really see them as mutually exclusive. And I think when I wrote the Love Boat books, I wrote a book with 30 different Asian American characters, and I wanted to showcase that diversity within the community. So some of them are STEM majors, and some of them are art majors, and some of them don't know what they're going to do with their lives, and that's fine. And what I found over time is that my girly girl, who is kind of boy crazy, she goes on this, for those who don't know about the Love Boat program, it's an actual program in Taiwan where parents would send their kids to learn Chinese language and culture, and also to find a spouse. And this was actually a real thing, and that's how it got its nickname Love Boat. But it ends up really being a summer free-for-all where the kids kind of just go crazy, sneaking out clubbing and dancing, but they're really high-performing kids. And so in some ways, it's kind of a way to blow off steam. And as I was writing the book, I realized, my really girly girl character, who she's there to find a husband, she's totally boy crazy, she's a cheerleader, but she's actually a girl in STEM. And she's not what you think of when you think of STEM. And that was actually something that really struck me. I'm like, this is a story really worth following and seeing what is she going to do with this juxtaposition of her two selves.
Well, Love Boat Taipei was a huge New York Times bestseller, explosion. I think movie rights, right? It did so well. But you've decided you've got a sequel out there now. You brought back a few of the main characters, right? Sophie and Xavier, right? Why did you decide to focus on them for the sequel?
Well, when I wrote the first book, I actually wrote it originally from 4 points of view. So Ever, who's my main character of book one, Rick, who is one of the love interests, Xavier, and Sophie. And Xavier is like from a wealthy Taiwanese family. I actually wrote 120,000 words, 4 points of view, and I realized I had just way too much story for one book. So I had to scrap that whole thing, rewrote the whole thing from scratch. But I had all this leftover story after this, and I realized Xavier's story especially wasn't told. He actually has learning differences. He's got dyslexia that was undiagnosed for many years. But I also wanted, and Sophie is romantically interested in him in book one, and so I kind of felt like the two of them would team up to do something together. And so book two begins with Sophie going to Dartmouth, recognizing that her summer of trying to find the right guy was a complete disaster. So she's sworn off boys, and now she's going to double down and be the best artificial intelligence major that Dartmouth has ever seen. but she is still herself. Like she still loves fashion and clothing. And so what she tries to do is bring together her fashion interests with a project in her artificial intelligence class. And she's actually trying to get in off the wait list. So she really, the stakes are high. She needs to impress the professor. So he'll let her in. But he's just not that interested in her project. He's like, he has all these questions like about why this fashion app that she's trying to build is not going to work. And I found, working in Silicon Valley with a lot of startup companies, that was true for a lot of girls, a lot of female-led startups. It was hard for them to get funding. It was hard for them to kind of bring their ideas forward. They just were met with this wall of skepticism, and nobody realized it was actually implicit bias. Nobody would have said like, oh, it's because she's a girl, but that's what was happening. And so I think with Sophie, I was trying to really kind of show like, hey, you can be all these things. You can be fashion obsessed and a cheerleader, and you can also be in STEM.
Well, I thought she's a really wonderfully written character. I enjoyed seeing it through her perspective, and I'm rooting for her the entire time in the novel, I must admit. You answered my next question, which was like how you integrated artificial intelligence and all that you've been working with. I'm curious, do you mind? You have a passage from the book you could share with us today?
I'd love to, yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned, she doubles down at Dartmouth. So this is actually a passage from her first day of the class. It's jam-packed with all these people talking about things that she's never heard of. And her professor is very intimidating. He's up on the board. And so here's kind of when class kicks off. A video of Harrison Ford plays on the screen. Han Solo. His gray hair hangs neatly over his lined face. He raises a blue Yeti mug at us. Welcome to Introduction to Artificial Intelligence, he says. You're in for the ride of a lifetime with my good friend, Professor Horvath. I want to personally wish you well as you start the year. Also, I'm not actually Harrison Ford. I'm a deep fake, but I wish you well nonetheless. I laugh with the class as Professor Horvath takes center stage, hooking a thumb in his pants pocket. Well, as my good friend Harrison Ford said, first, a word to those, welcome, as my good friend Harrison Ford said. Now, first, a word to those on the wait list, as I know we have several hundred waiting anxiously. I'm sorry to say we are simply limited by auditorium capacity. I encourage you to find alternative classes, but if you're still hoping for the Horvath touch, please audit the class for now and submit your project proposals for the first assignment, which I will tell you about shortly. If spots open up in the next 2 weeks, I will admit waitlisted students based on the quality of your proposals. A few groans go up. A guy in the seat in front of me heads for the doors. The guy behind me motions to the empty seat. I almost refuse on principle, but I focus better when I can take notes, so I drop into it. This arrangement is actually good for me. If I can jump the wait list with a kick-ass proposal, then I actually have a real shot at getting in. Now onward, says Professor Horvath. AI is revolutionizing everything from robotics to energy to healthcare and everything in between. You will learn the fundamentals of artificial intelligence and how to build algorithms that are changing our world. Chatbots that talk to people, tools to help doctors. He launches into a world I've only ever associated with gamers. I type furiously, taking notes like I never have. I Google every other word he says and scan Wikipedia for context, deep learning, deep fakes, chatbots. I'm going to learn the secrets to unlocking the universe. I'm going to learn magic.
I was hoping you would choose that passage too. That was my favorite. So let me build off of that because I love the way you describe that. How is science like magic?
There's so many things that we don't understand still about the universe. Like the universe is just incredibly large. We haven't even penetrated our own galaxy. And I think there's like an incredible magic in that. Like there's magic is like things, like things happen, like people levitate or, a wand moves and something happens at the side of the room. And I think sometimes we see that with science too. There's, and then when you dig down into the fundamentals of why it does work, we often find that there's just incredible, beautiful design at the core of things. And that to me is magical.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about how, I know the statistics for college that college now has many more young women than young men enrolled. But how do we get more young women? How do we get more representation in the STEM areas, in the STEM fields?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. When I went to law school, my class was actually slightly more women, but as I rose through the ranks and moved into leadership, the women all started to drop out. And I think there's a lot of factors at play. As I mentioned, I was actually chemistry at Harvard my first year, and then I ended up dropping out too. And I look back on that; that was the right choice for me. But I wondered if I would have stayed if there had been other women like me in the class, and there just weren't. And so I didn't have friends in my class. I didn't have a community. Like if I went to class and afterwards we all went out for lunch, or went to see the movies together, then maybe that community would have helped tie me there longer. So I think that's part of it, is just building community where girls feel welcomed. They feel like, this is where I belong and I can do this. There's a lot of talk now, like this is what a scientist looks like, and they have like many diverse faces, and I love that movement. And then I think it's like kind of what I was, addressing in the book, like there's many ways of being a scientist, and there is so much that we haven't explored. So one example, in artificial intelligence, a couple of years ago, there was this artificial intelligence human resources app that did not correlate women with leadership roles. And this is actually deeply embedded in the historical data. Like women just historically were not getting leadership roles, and therefore their resumes, even if you stripped out their names and their gender, like their resumes still may have reflected some, feminine past, like maybe ballet or instead of football. And I think it takes a woman being at the table to even notice that this is happening. And it, just in the same way, it takes that diverse person at the table to notice, hey, this AI facial recognition is not working on my darker skin. And so like, I think empowering younger women to realize like they have a special and unique voice to bring to a field that traditionally has not had their voices there.
We need to change that table. You're exactly right. Abigail, back to your book. This is the sequel. Are we going to see another adventure? Is there something else that you're working on?
I wish I could share more. I will be able to share more soon. I actually do have multiple STEM books that are coming. They're forthcoming, that draw more on the world of artificial intelligence, of technology. I have a short story that is out in the world called The S.T.E.A.M algorithm. And it's about a kid in Silicon Valley whose girlfriend gets kidnapped, and he builds an algorithm to find her using idiom. So that, again, that's another tie-in between like the language and the sciences. But yeah, I have many more projects that are kind of just coming out of my time in Silicon Valley.
I can't wait to see those projects and read that story too. Where can I find that?
So that is actually in an anthology with Macmillan that came out in January called Serendipity. So this is actually the funny thing about my books. They are romantic comedies. And so people don't actually think, oh, STEM or girls in STEM. And same with like my short story. It's in an anthology of rom-com, YA rom-com stories. But that's partly, I think what I'm doing is like, as girls are reading these romantic comedies, they also find like, hey, and I can also be a girl in STEM and love romantic comedies.
I found when I was researching your book, when you go to the chat rooms that discuss your book, you have changed so many lives. Everyone says exactly what you're saying there. Like, I expected to read it for this reason, but instead, this is what I found. And it was universal throughout them how many people you've inspired, not only to read a great book, but to truly get involved in these things that they're not, encouraged perhaps by parents or others. And I loved that. And again, such an inspiration. So thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to hear that.
And off the record, you could tell me what's coming next, because I'm so curious. Now I'm hooked. Thank you.
I will say the film is coming. Yeah, the film, we wrapped filming. It's all announced. We have Ashley Lau starring as Ever Wong, Ross Butler starring as Rick, and a number of other folks. So I'm so thrilled with the film and excited to share it with the world.
When can we expect that?
So no date's been announced yet, but what has been announced is the casting. We filmed, and Lionsgate is on board as our global distributor. And Ashley actually was recently cast in The Hunger Games, which is super exciting.
I cannot wait.